So this story begins back in about mid-August when the temperature is still around 30 degrees every day. I just finished up building this bathroom inside the tiny house, and now it's time to move on with the rest of this build. So first things first, it's getting pretty intolerable working in here right now. It's getting up to about 40 degrees by midday. So I'm going to go ahead and install my mini-split unit, which is going to provide the air conditioning as well as the heat. This is just a 12,000 BTU unit I got from Senville, and I'm going to try to install this myself. And like everything, with no prior experience, just a manual and some YouTube videos. I was also really unsure what size BTU to order for the tiny house since it's not a typical application. But looking at this a few months later, I can say this 12,000 BTU is about right for the air conditioning as well as the heat, even in minus 10 or 20 temperatures. So after I did a dry fit of that between these two windows, I'm going to go ahead and install this mounting bracket. And I just measured this to make sure everything was equal between the windows and level. And then on the indoor unit of the mini-split, I cut away this breakout panel here and bent the pipes out the way I need them to exit the unit. And then I connected the electrical wires inside this access panel. So then I can take this up, and this just clips right onto that mounting bracket. And now first off, I'm going to drill a hole through the wall here that's going to allow this condensation drain pipe to feed through and drain all of the wastewater from condensation outside of the tiny house. All my other wiring is going to feed out a hole on the front side of the trailer. So I'm drilling this through with a long drill bit so that my two holes on the inside and outside line up. And then using a 2.5-inch hole saw to drill through my interior wall and my exterior wall. Then I can feed through my copper line set that came along with the mini-split. And meet these up with the line coming out of the interior unit, and then I'm going to connect these together using a couple of adjustable wrenches.
Oh, that's so hot.
So next I just bent my copper lines down to roughly where my outdoor unit is going to be, and I'm going to mount this unit on the front frame of the trailer using some of the standard U-channel you can get at Home Depot or wherever. So I measured out this channel so that I'm at least a foot away from the exterior wall as per code, and then use some self-tapping bolts and washers to tap these into the trailer. Then I can connect the outdoor unit onto the U-channel using some 1/2-inch stainless steel bolts. So now it's time to connect the lines, and my lines are a little bit long, so I'm going to actually cut and flare these and then attach them to the unit. So first I'd use one of these copper pipe cutters and just go around the pipe until it cut through. Then I'd clamp on this flaring tool and put a nice clean flare on the end of this line. I used some of the cutoff pipe to practice this a couple times because I had never done this before, just to make sure everything was working as it should. Now that copper line can seat right onto the outdoor unit and be tightened into place using that flare nut. So next I'm hooking up the electrical for this into a disconnect switch that was installed back a couple videos ago when we did the electrical. I'm running these wires through some waterproof conduit and then just following the wire diagram. Get someone to help you out with this part if you have no idea what you're doing, because this is pretty dangerous. But now that has the disconnect switch powering the outdoor unit, and then a wire runs from outdoor to indoor, giving power inside. So next I closed up that hole using the provided putty, and then wrap my lines using the provided pipe wrap. And then I'm going to install one of these line set covers to make this look a little bit neater. And now that's all the wiring and plumbing hooked up. Then using a cutoff wheel and my angle grinder, I can take off the excess of that U-channel. And then I'm using this cheap vacuum pump I got on Amazon, and I'm going to vacuum out these lines to get ready to release the refrigerant and turn this mini-split on. So I vacuumed out the lines for about a half an hour until I had a pretty solid vacuum going, and then I shut off the pump and released some refrigerant according to the directions. And after I let that sit for a half hour and it was still at the same pressure, which means there's no leaks, I can follow the directions to release all of the refrigerant and turn this mini-split on for the first time. I was really worried about noise because this is such a small space. And it's hard to describe how quiet this thing actually is, but this is the unaltered audio. So with the mini-split installed and running, I now need to cover up my line set that's currently running across my loft. So I have a piece of this dimensional 1x8 walnut that I had lying around the shop. And I'm going to go ahead and put a 1/4 inch round over on the one side of this piece. And then I'm going to use my table saw to rip off a piece of this shiplap wallboard. This is the same stuff that's used in the tiny house already, and it's already painted to match. So I'm going to attach this piece of wallboard to the underside of the walnut and basically have a walnut kind of countertop ledge thing up beside the bed in the loft. So I use my pocket hole jig to drill some pocket holes on the back side of this piece and screw that in with some pocket hole screws and some glue. Then I can flip this piece over and sand the walnut with some 120 grit. And then I'm going to put on a quick coat of this Rubio monocoat. And work that in with a white applicator pad, and then come back in about 5 minutes and wipe that as clean as possible. So to install this into the loft, I'm first using some scrap pieces of 2x4 and tacking these into the floor with some construction adhesive and brad nails. And then I'll add a little more construction adhesive on top to grab the ledge before I set that in place. And I added a couple brad nails where I knew it was backed by some 2x4 blocking, but the construction adhesive should hold this in place for the most part. Now I went back and forth in my mind a bunch of times between installing some new hardwood or finishing up the existing cedar for the loft floor, but then it finally hit me. Why wouldn't I use carpet, especially in a place where you're pretty much only going to be on your hands and knees? So first of all, I have these carpet tack strips, and I'm just going around all the walled edges of the floor and installing one of these about an inch away from the wall. Then after I got the surface nice and clean with a shop vac, I laid out some of this carpet underlay and tacked this into place with a stapler. And now we're ready for some carpet. So I got this roll of carpet off of one of those cut-by-the-yard carpet conveyor belt things at Lowe's, and being able to buy it in that amount meant this only cost, I think, like $200 in carpet. So I've never done any carpet work before, but I took my time stretching this out across the loft floor and cutting away the excess. Along the walled edges, I'd use this knee stretcher to knee the carpet and stretch it over those tack strips. And along the open edges, I use this carpet stapler to tack the carpet down, and then cut away the excess with a sharp knife. And now that's a much better option than the hardwood would have been. This is much easier on the hands and knees, and a mattress can just sit right on top of this. So at this point in the build, I actually moved the tiny house from its construction location at my dad's shop to its final location where I plan to live in it. I actually made a whole video on this that I released a couple of months ago, so you can go watch that as I fast forward through this part. Now with my tiny home at home, it's given me some new inspiration to get this project rolling again and get living in here. So I have some of this 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch aluminum angle that I'm going to use to trim around that rough carpet edge. So I just cut these pieces with my miter saw, and then measured out some even screw placement and pre-drilled those holes. Then I can install the rough fit of these pieces, and that should trim out the loft nicely. But I don't like the silver color, so I'm going to take these down and take them to my shop for a quick coat of some satin black spray paint. Now while that's drying, I'm going to start working on this kind of separation wall that'll separate the loft from the rest of the tiny house. So I have a bunch of lengths of these clear cedar 2x4s, and I'm just cutting them according to my plan there. Also, a quick tip for cutting finishing pieces like this is use a fine cut blade in your miter saw. I think this one's like a 60 tooth. That'll just make that end cut really clean and limit the amount of wood blowout, especially on this soft cedar. And honestly, I pretty much just use one of these blades all the time, even when I'm framing. It really doesn't take that much longer to cut. And then sanding each piece with 120 grit before I assemble this. So before I start gluing and nailing this, I'm using a square to make sure all my corners are pretty square. And then I'm just using some regular wood glue, and then tacking this together with a couple of 15 gauge nails. This is just kind of a geometric art piece that doubles as a wall for the loft. It's not really made for perfect privacy, more just to close in the area up there while still letting the natural light pass through, and hopefully it looks good as well. So I tried to be careful about where I was nailing this, and any of the nail holes that will be slightly visible I filled in with some cedar colored wood filler. And areas I knew weren't going to be visible at all, I used some screws to reinforce this a little bit. So to finish up this piece, I'm using some Danish oil, the same thing I used on the ceiling of the tiny house, so this should match that perfectly. And I'd just flood this on with a brush, and after I did 2 or 3 slats, I'd come back with some shop towels and wipe off the excess. And now that's ready to install. So first I gotta reinstall my aluminum angle that's now nice and black. And then my accent wall can be lifted into place. I secured this with some screws and a 90-degree attachment for my impact, and that's looking pretty darn good. So before I can build the staircase up to my loft, I have to insulate this wheel well, which is the last thing yet to be closed in. So I first cased around the wheel well with some of this 1x4 lumber, and added in a couple of these studs for something to nail the ends of my plywood into. And then I cut up some of this 2-inch rigid insulation. This is the same insulation that I used to insulate the floor as the very first step of building this tiny house. To attach the insulation to the wheel well, I'm using some of this foam construction adhesive and just sticking the foam straight onto the steel. I'd also use some screws to tack this insulation together while the foam's set up. I added one layer of 2-inch foam, and then over top of that I added a second layer of 1 inch, giving me 3 inches of total insulation and an R value of 15. And then I have a couple sheets of this 1/2-inch maple plywood and measuring out the widths I needed for this, and then cutting them out using this Craig jig for my circular saw, which makes these rip cuts really easy. I'd add a few lines of window and door foam behind each sheet of plywood just so that it has some structure behind it and it doesn't have that loud hollow knocking sound anytime anything touches it. And then I'd brad nail the sheets into anywhere I had some wood backing. And that cased that in nicely. The seams will be under the cabinet, so I'm not worried about those, and I just gave that a quick coat of paint to match. So now I can start building my staircase up to the loft. I have my plan here, and I'm actually going to be making these pretty much in the exact same way you make kitchen cabinets, using some 3/4 inch pre-finished maple plywood. So I'm cutting out all the sizes of panels I need with a track saw. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on how I'm making these cabinets because my next video is going to be all about making the kitchen, and I'm going to explain in detail how kitchen cabinets are made. And this is essentially the same process, I just put in a few extra cross members because this is going to structurally support the weight of human bodies. So with my first 2 steps / cabinets done, I taped that off and gave them a coat of paint on the front edge and anywhere that was going to be visible in the staircase. Then we can bring these into the tiny house, and I fasten these onto the wall and floor just using some normal construction screws. So the next step of building this staircase is going to be making a newel post for the railing. For that, I have some of this 2-inch thick black walnut, and I ripped this into 2 about 4-inch wide sections. Then I ran this through my jointer a bunch of times to get one of the faces completely flat on each piece so that I can glue them together. And after that's set up overnight, I can take off the clamps and then continue to joint two of the faces. And then run the opposite faces through the planer so that this has a consistent thickness and width through the whole thing. Now I have about a 3" by 3" wide black walnut post. And I'm going to cut the one end flush with my miter saw. And then on the other end I just have this about 12-degree bevel. And I'm kind of just making a point or something that looks pretty. I gave this a good sand up to 120 grit, and then I can finish this up with a quick coat of Rubio Monocoat. So to install this into the tiny house, I first clamped this onto the cabinet and made sure it was level. And then I pre-drilled a hole and just tacked this onto the cabinet using a 3" deck screw. And then I secured this a little more permanently using a couple of these lag bolts. And then it's back to the shop to whip up a few more oddly shaped cabinets. So this staircase will actually have drawers all the way up. The only exception to that is that second step. Because the wheel well is there, it just didn't make sense for the space I was going to get out of a drawer to do the extra engineering. But so far that is literally the only wasted space in the entire volume of this tiny house. There was a few spots I had to use some surface screws, so I filled that in with some wood filler. And after that's set up and I sanded it, I can prime that surface and repaint it. Now I can add my handrail. So I have this piece of maple, which is actually two pieces of 3/4" maple I glued together, and I'm just holding this up in position while I mark my two cut lines. So before I cut this, I'm going to soften the corners on here, so I'm using a 1/4" roundover bit on all four sides. And then I'm adjusting my miter saw to the slope of my staircase, which is about 41 degrees. To fasten this to the staircase, I'm going to be using some screws through the surface like this. And I want to be able to hide these screws, so I have this 45-degree drill jig. And I'm going to countersink these holes a bit so that I can fill them up with a dowel afterwards. I'm just using some number 10 construction screws to fasten each end of this railing. And then I have some 3/8" dowel I'm gluing and hammering into place. After that glue's dried for a couple hours, I came back with my multi-tool and trimmed it fairly flush. And then gave everything a final sand. before taping it off and giving it a coat of primer. And then a few coats of some black paint. This is cabinet paint, which is quite a bit stronger than wall paint, so it should resist the hands rubbing over this for quite a few years before it wears through. So now it's time to start making my stair treads. I've had these big walnut slabs sitting in my shop since about March. I was planning to get at this a lot sooner, but my neck had different plans for the year. And if you're looking for a good place to get these big slabs, I got this from Backwoods Timber in southwestern Ontario. So like a lot of stuff in this tiny house, I really want these stair treads to stand out and not just be a typical chunk of wood. So I'm going to be making this really similar to the way you would make an epoxy dining table. I first took these slabs and ripped them in half right down the middle. And then I have some of this 1/2 inch melamine, and I'm ripping some 2.5 inch wide strips off of this. And screwing this into a rectangle that will be the walls for my epoxy mold, but it's also going to be a template to help me visualize what this is going to look like. So this is going to be a standard epoxy river table layout. After I had the slabs in the position I thought they looked pretty good, I traced on my cut lines and just trimmed up the slabs as needed. Now back to that epoxy mold. I'm drilling a bunch of pocket hole screws about every foot around the perimeter of that template wall. And then I'm screwing this wall onto a fresh sheet of melamine. Then I'd go around with some silicone caulking and seal up all the seams to make this watertight. So that's one part of this completed, and I'm actually going to have 3 different molds here, so I whipped up a couple more templates. And cut up my second slab according to those. From here, I'll go ahead and cast the epoxy and let that cure up. And then the stair treads will be cut to dimension right out of these molded pieces. Before I cast these slabs in epoxy, I'm sanding the edges down with 120 grit to get rid of any bark residue or dirt or whatever's on these slabs. I also used a wire wheel in my drill for the hard to reach areas. Then I'm mixing up some regular tabletop epoxy and sealing all of these edges as well as all the cracks and abnormalities with this epoxy. This is going to seal up all the pores in the wood and all the softer dead wood. And you want to do this because that soft wood would release bubbles the whole time the casting epoxy is curing, and oftentimes screw up the final product with a bunch of bubbles. And after that's set up for about 24 hours, I can come back with my sander and just scuff up the surface using 120 grit sandpaper that will allow the casting epoxy we're about to pour to mechanically bond to this surface. And I also used a sanding disc in my angle grinder to get rid of any of the epoxy beading. And scuffed up any of the hard to reach areas by hand as well as I could. So now I'm just leveling my workbenches with some shims to get those molds as level as possible. And then before I put my slabs in here, I'm going to spray the entire surface of the mold with a generous coat of this epoxy mold release. Now it's finally time to pour the epoxy. The epoxy I'm using for this is designed for casting up to 2 inches thick, and that's really important. You can't just use a normal tabletop epoxy for casting because it's going to overheat and just bubble and completely ruin your project. So I mixed together my part A and part B, and then I'm going to be dyeing this epoxy an opaque black, so I'm using some alcohol inks. I have 3 of these little jugs for each 3-gallon kit, which is about 30 milliliters of ink. Then I can thoroughly mix this with my drill, and I try to mix for the length of a song or two in my headphones so that I know everything's perfectly mixed. By the way, one of the most common questions I get is, what am I listening to in my headphones in every video? To be honest, it's all over the place. My music library has about 5,000 songs of all different genres. I usually throw on an album, and some of my most common listened to albums are the Marshall Mathers LP, Audioslave self-titled, some Zach Bryan albums, Tyler Childers, Billy Talent, and many others. So I used about 10 gallons of casting epoxy for this. This is just a cheap casting epoxy I get from a local company called Rusty Design in Burlington, Ontario, and cost about $600. I actually poured this on 2 different days. I poured it about halfway the first day and let that set up, and then came back and poured the rest the next day just to limit the heat and bubbling. So after about 5 days, that's set up rock solid, so I can deform my 3 pieces. And then I'm taking this out to a local sawmill to get planed and sanded, because that saves me about 2 days of work with a router sled and gives me a better product overall. Most places charge $50 to $100 to do this, so just go out and do it. It'll save you a lot of time and headaches. So now I can start measuring out the pieces I need and cutting them out of these slabs. So to cut these pieces, I'm using this new Makita track saw I just bought. Up until this point, for a track saw, I've always been using just a regular circular saw and this Craig jig, and it works okay, but lately I've had a lot of trouble with it jamming on these thicker slabs. And I'm sure this could be tinkered with to fix the problem, but for this project I need some really precise cuts, so I guess it's time to finally upgrade to a real track saw. This Makita was the cheapest one I could find, and it is honestly sick. If you don't have a track saw and can afford it, go out and get yourself one right now. Some of these treads were pretty complex, so instead of guessing at this with a tape measure, I ripped off some 1.5-inch wide sections of 1/4-inch plywood, and then I'm hot gluing this around the perimeter of my tread to make a template that I can then trace on to the walnut boards. This should guarantee a perfect fit because these are expensive and time-wasting mistakes if you miscut one of these treads. So whenever you do an epoxy cast, you're always going to have some little pits like this that need filled in. So a really quick way to fix these holes is to use some of this epoxy putty. This is a 2-part putty that you cut a little bit off and mash it together. And then work it into these pits and voids. And I'm not kidding, after about 15 minutes this stuff is fully set up, and I can use one of these backhoe scrapers to plane off the excess. and give that a quick sand and it looks good as new. This is much quicker. I used to always fill these up with some more epoxy, and I'd have to wait a day for that to set up and then come and plane that off. And sometimes there was still some pitting left, so I'd have to do that all over again, where this makes that process about 15 or 20 minutes. On all the overhanging parts of the stair treads, I'm using this 1/4-inch roundover bit and giving them a nice smooth transition. And then sanding all these pieces with 100 grit. You don't want to go any higher for this because this is a floor technically, and you don't want it to be too shiny and slippery where 100 grit will still have some good tack to it. Before I apply the finish, I'm giving all the pieces a clean with some mineral spirits. And waiting for that to fully dry, and that should take away most of the residual dust. Like always, I'm going to be finishing these pieces with some Rubio Monocoat. This is a really nice hard wax finish that leaves the natural feel of the grain and looks great pretty much every time. So I first mix this up with 3 parts of the oil to 1 part of the accelerator that comes on top of the can, and then drizzled a bit of this over a piece. I use one of these white applicator pads on a low setting on my sander and just work this into the wood. And then after that's soaked in for 3 or 4 minutes, I come back with some clean rags and wipe off as much of the excess as I possibly can. And that's it. That's a fully protected piece after the Rubio cures up in a few days. No worrying about spraying or brush strokes, just give the piece a good even sand, apply the Rubio, and you're good to go. Now back to the tiny house to install these treads. I'm using some regular PL construction adhesive and putting a few beads of this across the top of the stair cabinets. And then just setting a tread in place and putting some weight on it to get that to bond. The stencils I created to fit the treads work perfectly. This is probably the most precise fit I've had on anything I've ever built. So definitely worth the extra effort on that. Now that looks pretty sweet. So this one step here is actually going to open upwards to reveal this bin below it. So to hinge this, I'm using one of these black piano hinges. And I taped that into place on the back of the tread, and then pre-drilled my holes and secured them with the supplied screws. Then I'm putting a few strips of this mounting tape on the other side of the hinge, so that I can take this over to the stair and stick it in place onto the wall behind it. And then I can fasten in a few of my screws, make sure everything's opening properly, and then take those screws out and remove the mounting tape, and then continue installing all the screws. And that worked out pretty good. So next I'm measuring out the drawers for all of my stair cabinets. Again, the next video I'm going to be going over how to make all my kitchen cabinets, including drawers, faces, everything, so I'm just going to time-lapse through this part for now. I also had my camera on the wrong setting for part of this, so some of this is only shot in 1080p, sorry about that. Now with the drawers installed, I need to make all the drawer faces. Same deal with this. This is all going to be covered in the next video when I build the kitchen. So I'm just going to speed through this. After I had those painted up and they dried for a few days, I installed the drawer faces on the drawers. And then installed my handles. So with my staircase built with this cabinet technique, I saved almost all the space that lies underneath these stairs, and now I have a bunch of drawers and usable storage space. Now I'm on to basically just some finishing touches for the loft area. So I have some of this trim, same as I used in the last video, that I'm going to trim around the landing with, as well as up around the loft, and anywhere else that's for the most part finished. I nailed this in with a bunch of brad nails, and then I'd go around and fill the nail holes with this crown molding caulking, as well as all the miters, because you know what they say, if you have a crack, just shove some caulk in it. For all the outside corners that I have some of this 1/8 inch thick by 1 inch aluminum angle that I'm going to use to case around my corners. So I first scuffed this up using my sander so that the paint would mechanically adhere to it a little better, and then gave it a coat of primer. And then some of my wall paint. Then I can cut this to length. And to adhere this to the corner, I'm using some PL construction adhesive and just put in a bead every 8 inches or so. And then stick this right onto the corner. And now that's making it look a lot more finished. Around these top edges here, I have some 3/4 inch aluminum flat bar that I prepared in the same way, and I'm using this to case around this edge. I would just use some lengths of painter's tape to hold this up for a couple hours just until that construction adhesive bonded. Now I can start moving in. You've probably already seen this in some clips, but a while ago I moved up a queen size mattress. And that fits up here pretty much perfectly, and it actually gives me more headroom than I thought. I can still pretty much sit up straight on the bed. It's really not very coffin-like at all, actually. That was one of my main concerns with the loft setup. I also added in this bedside lamp that I have a wall mount for. This is a dimmable lamp, and it also has some USB outlets to charge your phone or whatever. And now up in the loft is essentially done. Now one more thing before I finish this video. With my bedroom done, I'm getting pretty eager to start spending my nights out in my tiny house. So I'm having my couch delivered from a local furniture shop. This is a full-size sofa because, again, this is already a small space. I didn't want to compromise on anything else by having small, uncomfortable furniture. So this is a pretty top-of-the-line couch that also pulls out into a bed for an extra sleeping spot if I have anybody over. And now this place is almost livable, at least part-time, after one more very important thing. I picked up this Samsung frame 65-inch TV on a Black Friday deal. And I've known about these TVs for a while, and I figured it'd be the perfect thing for the tiny house because they sit so slimly to the wall. I would say it sits only about an inch off the wall, which is perfect for the space where every inch matters. It also has art mode, so instead of shutting off the TV, you can turn it to these pictures of paintings, which basically makes it look like a canvas on the wall, and it's another cool way to make this space really nice and make it feel larger than it actually is. I am absolutely loving the way this tiny house is turning out. As I've said many times in these videos, my whole idea with this build is to go way over the top in detail and design, and make up for what this house lacks in space, with creativity and no compromise on quality. So far the design has worked out nicely, and this is actually a pretty spacious little apartment. I now spend pretty well every night out here and a little bit before bed watching some TV, and I'll be starting work on the kitchen shortly after Christmas. Speaking of Christmas, we finally got our first blast of snow, and it completely changed the landscape. This is one of my favorite times of year, especially when we get blankets of snow like this, and I gotta say it really accents the tiny house nicely. Coming out of living in a basement, one of the main things I wanted with this was a lot of windows, and this space delivers that nicely, especially when it's snowy and beautiful like this. It's like sitting on the edge of a snow globe. So that's pretty much it for this video. One more thing before I go. As a lot of you know, I've been selling merch now for a couple of years through some third-party services. And to be honest, I've just never really been happy with the quality of the shirts, and it's just something I feel like I wouldn't actually wear myself. So if you want it done right, do it yourself. I've decided to try something new and do a merch drop that was fully made by me. So I'm sending some of these packages to Amazon that you can then buy from there. And in each one of these packages is going to be a really nice t-shirt that I printed myself. It's a quality shirt that's actually comfortable to wear and wash as well, and is going to last for many years. You'll also get one of these Drew Build Stuff tape measures, and a postcard that's personally signed by me. I only made around 20 of each size, so if you're interested, get on it before they're gone. I've been trying to get these to Amazon before Christmas as a last-minute gift idea, but unfortunately shipping in Canada keeps getting delayed right now because of Canada Post, so it might be a few more days till these are available, but you can follow me on my Instagram at Drew Build Stuff if you're interested, and I'll post when they're available there. Till next time, thanks for watching. I gotta get back to my tiny house living. And oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see how this turns out in the end. The next video should be the final one on this tiny house.